Thank you very much. I'm pleased and honored to be back. The reason why I'm pleased and honored is also because I very much enjoyed the first time, and I think that the work that you're doing in a group that is called for Social Engagement Studies is something that I feel deeply about. So thank you to all the people who made this possible, and thank you, Gazelle, for this introduction. I stand here in state of emergency. And what I mean by that is that if you're French today, it's not just when you're in France that the state of emergency applies. As a citizen, the question of how I travel is caught up in this discussion about the state of emergency. That is, even when I'm away from France, I remain French, and in many ways even more so. I start from this, and in the wake of the discussion that we had yesterday with Athena Athanasiou, we shared about the provincial status or the provincialization of many places, and my feeling is that we should sort of reverse the situation, that of course we have to speak from where we are and from where we belong, whatever that means, and therefore I do not want to erase this Frenchness. So there's a situated way of thinking from a standpoint. This, of course, has a feminist history, but I think it has to be broadened as a... Sorry. Thank you. I'll speak close to the mic. And actually, I learned yesterday that the mic circulating is not fake. It's a pseudo-fake mic. We'll have to revert to that. But so let me start with a French phrase, which is état d'urgence. État d'urgence can translate both as emergency, but also as urgency. And I think the combination of the two says something about what the state is saying, emergency, and about our situation trying to produce arguments, to produce words, to produce representations. And so I believe that this is what we should do. The title of the conference, How to Act Together, raises for me a question, or rather two questions. How to act together with whom? And what for? That is, acting together may sound nice, but at the moment, as a French citizen, what I do is oppose what is called national union. The discourse of we have to stick together, which was used in January at the time of the attacks and which is used again today, is very problematic from my perspective. So the question is not to act together, acting together with whom and for specific purposes, and this is what we have to define. So togetherness is not necessarily good. There are many people I don't want to be together with, none in the room. And this, in the context of France, if I may insist again on that context, national unity meant that there was an almost unanimous vote in the National Assembly in favor of the state of emergency, and at the same time, playing on a vocabulary that is relevant, of course, to Judith Butler's latest book that will be discussed this afternoon, at the same time, assembly in the streets, assembly in the squares is being forbidden. So, for example, demonstrations about the climate change, and when there's the international meetings about climate change, but also demonstrations in support of migrants, etc. So, on the one hand, this assembly, let's all play together, is translating into a state of emergency, and on the other hand, the state of emergency translates into the impossibility to demonstrate. So I stand here in a state of demobilization, and this is one point that I want to start from, and there's a happy ending, I think, to my presentation up to a point. The question that I want to discuss is not the same, I believe, as the one that is raised by Judith Butler in her book. She's interested in starting from those who are left out, who are excluded and to think about mobilization, about assembly, about participation from the point of view of those who are excluded, overlooked, unheard, etc. My point is in some ways the opposite, though of course not in contradiction. I first have been interested in those who don't vote, for example, who do not participate, not because they're excluded, but because in many ways they feel it's meaningless and they couldn't care less. And that, I think, is one of the key issues when we're thinking about what's going on, not just in France, but in many countries, I believe. But also, and this will be the focus of my presentation, I'm interested in those who are, at the moment, giving up. That is, I think the demobilization of many activists is a crucial issue. That is, despair is one of the keys. And this is why I would say that I stand here in a state of depression. Depression, I think, is a political notion at the moment. It's not just a psychological condition. Depression is what is happening to many on the left. I more or less edited or contributed to a book on the Roma question in France, and there were 4 authors. There are 4 authors. 2 are journalists. 1 is an activist, and I'm the only academic. I will go back to that about the question of how to work together as academics and as activists. But I want to mention the case that is narrated in the book of this activist. What he says is how much working on the Roma issue in France has destroyed him. That is, supporting the Roma in a context where no one cares, including in his own political party, the Communist Party, goes beyond defeat. I mean, it's one thing to lose battles. That's what politics is about. It's another to feel that the terms you want to use make no sense to anyone. And I think this battle is crucial today for politics. How can we avoid depression if we feel that the world is going in a direction that is the opposite of what we want, but also if we feel that it's for necessary conditions, for necessary reasons, that it's going in the wrong direction? That is, because the language that is used makes what we say irrelevant. That is, even if we're heard, we're not heard. And this, I think, accounts for much of the depression. That is, we all do our work, and we produce arguments, and depending on our positions, we publicize them more or less, etc., including in private conversations, etc. But in the end, we feel that this language that we're using is not working. So this question of depression has appeared to me, and the case of the Roma question is essential because that's the one where defeat is most visible, where the radical politics of racialization of the Roma population in France, but in much of Europe, is going on without much opposition. And this, I think, I have observed, has led to different kinds of reactions among activists. I have seen activists in France on the Roma issue who are completely depressed, in particular communists. Why? Because they wanted to change the world. The ones who were less depressed were Catholics, because Catholics know that there's something else beyond. And I've exposed that in the presence of both Catholics and communists, and so I've tested the argument. I'm not sarcastic about it. There's irony in it, of course. And this, I think, is something that we should bear in mind. That is, how can we have people not be depressed regardless of what's going to happen after life? So I stand here in a state of resistance. At the same time, I would say that I'm not totally comfortable with the word resistance. I think much of the left has been living with the idea of resistance, which means that basically we're not defining the terms, which means that basically we're doing our best to slow the process. We're doing our best not to change the course of events, but to limit the damage. And it seems to me that is part of the depression. The depression is not just the fact that we don't get what we want, but again, that we do not define the terms in which everything is being discussed. We discuss in the terms of those whom we criticize. So not defining the terms, I think, is what happens when we only think in terms of resistance. Obviously, I'm not criticizing resistance, and I guess that's what I do, is try to resist. So I'm not condescending about resistance. I'm just saying that it seems to me insufficient because that will not affect the state of things. So I stand here in a state of intellectual mobilization. And it seems to me that from the situation that I have described in France, that means that I have to think about the fact that I do not expect things to change because of politicians at the moment. That is, the recent vote for me, the near unanimous vote, is confirmation that whatever I can hope for is not going to happen there. So the question is, once we've said that, how can we think about politics outside of the political world, outside of political professionals? And I think this can be turned around as a positive, not just the disappointment with professional politicians, but the encouragement to do politics otherwise, that is not as a profession. That's the way, it seems to me, to avoid the impression that many of us have that there is no alternative. It used to be that there is no alternative was a discourse on the right. And then it moved to parties, social democratic parties such as the Socialist Party in France and other parties throughout Europe. But it seems to me that even if we're on the left, even though we keep saying that another world is possible, deep down we think that maybe there is no alternative. And this is what I would want to conjure. And this is where I think the work of intellectuals on the one hand and the work of activists on the other, but I will question this opposition, can have some interest. Now, what does this distinction between intellectuals and activists mean? I remember a footnote to a text that Judith Butler wrote many years ago in which she questioned the fact that she'd been interpolated by someone in the audience and who assumed that because she was an intellectual, she was not an activist. And she responded by saying that on the one hand, activists read books, and on the other, intellectuals also can be activists, that this opposition is not something we should start from. However, I think there's a difference between the work of intellectuals and the work of activists, and that's the audience that it's meant for. Of course, intellectual work is political work, just like the work of activists is political work. However, the audience, I believe, is not the same. And that has consequences. That is, if you are producing intellectual work in academia, the first audience is academic, which means there are rules of the game. And you're supposed to abide by these rules. Of course, you can play with them, and that's what we all try to do. But at the same time, by playing with them, we're acknowledging the fact that they're the rules. And so it doesn't mean that it's less political, but it's political with the specific constraint of intellectual work. And same for activists. I mean, activists are not, even when they're producing intellectual arguments, they're producing intellectual arguments with an audience, an intended audience, that is primarily that of activists. So I think we have to start thinking about those audiences and to see how we can combine them. And this is something that I have tried to do in my own work, in my own intellectual activism, that is to merge the different audiences. I said before about this book jointly written with an activist and with journalists, that has been an attempt, and I will give other examples. Now, one question is, if we take seriously the political work done by intellectuals and done by activists, it helps us, I believe, question the political uses of the word representation. Political representation is generally interpreted in terms of reflection, that is, reflecting the population, reflecting the French. And in fact, of course, representatives in the National Assembly or in the Senate, etc., claim to speak in the name of. This, I think, is problematic at a time when we have to think about political representation in terms that are different. If we do not want to be trapped in this representation of representation, if we do not want to be trapped in the idea that some people are the spokespersons for others, we have to question that. And instead of thinking in terms of reflection, then, of course, I think we have to think in performative terms. That is, representation is not reflecting a pre-existing reality, it's producing a reality. And this is what many politicians in France, many professional politicians in France, and I believe throughout the world, are constantly denying. They do not say that they're producing the world that we live in. They just say that they reflect the world that we live in. And in so doing, they're denying the reality of politics. That is, they give the impression that nothing is happening, that they're not doing anything, they're just managing a situation and reflecting what people want. And I think we have to take seriously the fact that they do produce a world. For example, I do believe that the French president a few days ago, in reacting to attacks in Paris by insisting on the possibility of denaturalizing binational citizens who were born French should they commit terrorist attacks, was performing a reality of France. That is, he was creating a representation of France that did not pre-exist. Because before he did say that, this kind of discourse was a right-wing discourse, possibly an extreme right-wing discourse. By making this into a presidential statement by a socialist president, what he's saying is that this is what France is about. How could we deny it since we have the French president, François Hollande, saying in 2015 more or less the same thing that former French president Nicolas Sarkozy was saying in 2010. So jointly, they're producing a world in which there are two kinds of French citizens, those who are potentially exposed to losing their citizenship and those who are not. And in so doing, based on a criterion of origin, President Sarkozy yesterday, President Hollande today, are racializing the nation, racializing citizenship. So this is not reflecting a world. This is representing a world that comes to exist. It's creating a world through this performance. So this theory of representation, shifting from reflection to performance, I think is essential if we want to think beyond official political discourse. We have to think about the production of the world we live in. And I have tried in a small volume that I published last year, which is called Gauche, l'avenir d'une désillusion, on the future of a disillusion, that is the left. I have tried to argue that we can do two things in terms of the performative politics of representation. One, in French, is changer le peuple, changing the people. And as you perhaps can imagine, this phrase was not systematically well received. It had deliberate connotations that I kind of liked, but with a grain of irony. This is a theory of the people. Again, if we do not assume that reality pre-exists representation, but that representation creates a new reality, then this applies to the people. The people does not pre-exist political representation. And it's what I have criticized about politicians claiming that they're not really doing politics because they're just reflecting what people want, is what I would call populism. Populism in that definition means claiming that you're just speaking in the name of, that you're just reflecting, and therefore denying this production of a people. Now, for example, in reaction to the production of a people by François Hollande and Nicolas Sarkozy, I would suggest that we have to think of non-racialized ways of producing a people. For example, in the current context, much of the discourse on le peuple conflates the people and the working classes, which I believe is problematic. First, because we tend to believe that class is only about the working classes, whereas class is about all the classes. It's a concept. It's not just an empirical reality of the people under. So that's the theoretical question, but there's also a political question, is that in playing on this ambiguity between the people and the working classes, in the current context, the temptation is considerable to assume that when we say the working classes, we mean the white working classes, the non-immigrant, the non-Muslim. And this creation of a white people is, of course, the key to the racialization that I have described. The problem is not that France has long been a white country, and that, alas or fortunately, it's becoming less and less white. That's not the reality. France is becoming a white country. The more immigrants, the more non-whites, the more it becomes a white country. That is, whiteness is not just an empirical fact, it's a representation of society. And so the discourse about the whiteness of the nation, and again, I insist on France, but I fear that I'm not just talking about France, and that much of this could apply to many other countries in Europe today. But since I know France better, and since I started with this premise, I want to develop that. So I think the assimilation of the working class or working classes and of the people exposes to even greater risks of racialization and of whitening the nation. Now, one question is, how come this belief in the people, pre-existing politics, pre-existing representation is so widespread, including, I believe, among intellectuals? The answer to me has to do with class. That is, it's the guilt, the class guilt of intellectuals that encourages them to believe that there's something like the people that is distinct, and that the question is, how do we situate ourselves in relation to the people? Which is also a way of thinking we do not belong to the people. And it seems to me that we have to reverse that, not by assuming that there's a sort of guilt that has to be overcome by representing the people, by being good organic intellectuals of this or that group, but by assuming the fact that what we're doing is producing representations and that we're responsible for that. We shouldn't do the same thing as politicians are doing. If politicians say, I'm not doing politics, I'm just reflecting what people are saying, at least if we're paid, as I am, by the state to think about what's going on in society, then we should not fall for this. In addition to suggesting that we should changer le peuple, I made my condition even worse by suggesting that we should changer de peuple, which means, in a way, replacing the notion of the people, and precisely as a strategy for not replicating the populism as I have defined it. That means that we claim to speak in the name of whatever definition of people that we may have. I suggest using the term public, a public, or publics. The first examples that came to mind when I was trying to think about this were examples on the right, for some reason. And in particular, what struck me is that in the US, and then I'll switch to France, but these are the two countries that I have studied most. In the US, the religious right managed to embody the people for years, for decades. If you recall, for example, these maps that were produced at the time of presidential elections, where you could see Jesus Land, for example, which was a vast segment of the US. This Jesus Land was a production, a belief in the fact that this was what the people were about, and in particular, by contrast to so-called bobos. This argument about the real people versus the bobos has circulated throughout the world. That is, the idea that some people are close to reality because they're close to the people, because they're conservative, has been very effective. And by contrast, the idea that being far from reality is the condition for being on the left has worked very efficiently. So what do I mean when I talk about publics? I mean people who are mobilized for a specific cause. And I think the religious right managed that. That is, they gave the impression that they were the people because they were powerfully mobilized. And we have seen the same thing in the last few years with the religious right in France against so-called marriage for all. The idea that the people were in the street, which could be surprising if you looked at the fact that they came from Versailles and other places, and so didn't exactly look working class, and in fact had to disguise themselves so as not to look too bourgeois. And there were actually indications by the organizers that you should avoid, for example, the headband for women, which sort of signals the fact that you might come from certain parts of town, the 16th district of Paris or Versailles or whatever. And there were specific instructions given. Let's not look like what we are. Not only let's not look homophobic, that was one thing. Let's look like nice people. But in addition, let's not look like bourgeois people. Let's look like the people. And this production of a people mobilized around a cause was very efficient because, of course, it meant that those who supported equal rights were not the people. So this imposition of the idea that we are the people, I think, has to do with the creation of a public that is efficiently mobilized. And I believe that we have to think in those terms. And this is sometimes complicated by the fact that the public, as we used to think about it, had to do with the state. But of course, in the current context, that is, in a neoliberal context, in which the state is serving neoliberal economics, then the state may not be our best instrument for thinking about the public. So privatized publics, in the sense that it's about us, not just about the state, in a world in which professional politics are defined this way, I think may be necessary. If we wanted to take an example that is not on the right, because sometimes there are publics on the left, in the French context, I thought that the emergence of a movement in the years 2000, Réseau Éducation Sans Frontières, that is, activists who managed to change somewhat the discourse about immigration, and of movements about immigration that, for example, made it possible to change the terms somewhat and to think of migrants not just as migrants, but as migrants who could be students, or as migrants who could be workers. So migrant workers are not the same as migrants, and migrant students are not the same as migrant. So changing the terms, I think, was what they managed, and giving the impression that they were more numerous than they were was the key to this. And the reason why it seems to me important to think in those terms, that is, looking more numerous than we are, has to do with the fact that I suspect sometimes that we're not that numerous. And therefore, if we want to exist, whereas we know that we might not win elections, then giving the impression that we're innumerable and much more important and powerful and influential than we are may be good strategy. This is why I have recommended using my essential Frenchness. This is why I have recommended arrogance as a political strategy. For me, it's not an effort, but I'm sharing this. So I recommend that, and you can practice at home, which is a good place for arrogance. Imposing the terms, I think, is something that we should think about. I will finish with a few examples of some of my own involvements and in this light, that is changing the terms. I think participating in the battles about the Pax, that is the first round of battles about same-sex unions in France in the late 1990s, I think the politics was very much about language. That is, should we talk about the anthropological foundations of society, which is what many people thought, in particular what they expected from intellectuals? Could we talk about equality as an alternative formulation? And I think this is what happened. It was a battle between two kinds of discourses. But of course, within these sexual politics in the years 2000, the battle about language, I think, was very much renewed by the discussion about what we call sexual nationalisms, which includes homo nationalism, but also its equivalent in terms of women. And again, the question was, how do we define the terms? That is, do we find terms that help us go beyond the opposition between race and sex, between those who say, I prefer women and queers, and those who say, I prefer blacks and Muslims. This is, I think, this battle about representation that has taken place in the last 15 years. And this is, I think, where the job that we have, both as activists and as intellectuals, is about changing the terms of representation. Can we find a way to address both sex and race, and not in terms of one versus the other? I'll take a third example. I participated with a group of people, including our mutual friend, as one says in English, Michel Ferrer, in a group called Cette France-là, and which was dedicated to a critique of immigration policies under Nicolas Sarkozy. This, to me, was interesting in many ways, including because most of the participants in this collective were not academics, the vast majority, actually. I sometimes think that I may have been the only one at the time. But what was interesting apart from that, I think, was that what we tried to do, and sometimes successfully, though on the whole we didn't quite win, I must say, is shift the conversation from the problem of immigration to the problem of immigration policies. These battles about language, I think, are fundamental. What are we discussing? Are we discussing immigration, or are we discussing immigration policies? Where's the problem? So managing to do that, for example, organizing an audit of migration policies in France that involved elected officials in the National Assembly, in the European Parliament, and in the Senate around this definition of immigration policies was one element. In the same way about the Roma, which I and others in that book have tried to do, is to shift the discussion from the culture of the Roma to the politics of race, that is, the production of race through this culturalization of the Roma. I'm not saying we have been successful in these different attempts, but I'm just illustrating what I mean about changing the terms with which we describe what is going on. So the question is not just that we have a role to invent another world or to imagine another world that is a utopian version. The question is, first, I think, that we should try to change the terms with which we describe the world in which we live. It doesn't mean we shouldn't think about alternative worlds, but I think our first job is to question the terms that are used and to try to imagine alternative terms for describing the very same word, for this very same reality. I'm currently involved in an initiative, and I will almost end with this. So in 2 minutes at most, I'll be finished. I'm involved in an initiative that's called Reprenons l'Initiative. So let's, which I think is very clever, of course. It's about the politics of and policies of racialization. And one of the issues has been precisely to think about this in ways that I think have to do with the questions raised in this conference. That is, action together with whom? And in particular, one of the issues in this racialization of France, and I believe of Europe, is that racialization does not only affect minorities, it does not only affect racists, but it affects the whole of society, the whole of French society, but I think the whole of European societies, including anti-racism. One of the elements that has come to the surface in the last few years in France is that there's a risk that the racialization of the nation also means that there's a racialization of anti-racism with a division between two kinds of anti-racism. One that is non-white anti-racism, and the other one which, of course, will mean white anti-racism. Though, of course, it's not called that. It's called universalist anti-racism. But that's a risk that I think we're all exposed to at the moment, and I think finding ways to do that is not just intellectual work, it's also activist work, that is working with activists. And this is what I have tried to do along with others in that. So I'll end here by saying that what I have suggested in these reflections on representation and on the role of intellectuals and activists in thinking about representation, but also in producing representations, is to impose our terms. That is, to try to find ways in which we can speak in our own language instead of having this language imposed upon us. And so in response to the question how to act together, my answer would be that we should get our act together. Thank you.